Hey there, folks, and welcome to the very first episode of Writeous Incarnation. Let me just first say right off the jump, this was not the first name that came to my mind. I was trying to think of different ways to incorporate the word write into a title for something like this. And so the first thing I think I came up with was Rite of Passage, but W-R-I-T-E instead of R-I-T-E. You know, it seemed very apropos for what I'm doing here, or what I want to be doing. And of course, I looked it up, and there's already a podcast out there with that name, and it's actually about writing, which makes sense. But sometimes, you know, they've got these really cool names, but if it's for something completely unrelated to what you're doing, you might still be able to use it. But that talking about writing. And then the other one was The Right Way, you know, W-R-I-T-E way. Again, you know, it seemed to fit what I want to do. But of course, that was also taken. It's also about writing. So I don't know where Writeous Incarnation came from ultimately. It just like the other two. I mean, great minds, you know, and the idea that you're going to think of something that nobody else has ever thought of, it's pretty rare, but I didn't see anybody else with Writeous Incarnation the way it's spelled. So that's what I've settled on. And really, this is going to be about the writing journey, about the writing process, and my personal process. And my rule for doing this is I cannot release a video until I've written at least 1 hour beforehand on this particular manuscript or novel, essentially, that I'm working on right now. And that's partially to motivate me, but also because it's very easy. One of the hardest things to do is to actually get something down on paper. There's a lot of folks who have, you know, great imaginations. And if you talk to them, they'll say, oh, I had this idea for this and this. And I started, you know, I have this concept and, oh man, I've got the, and they'll tell you in great detail about it. I myself have done this. I've actually talked to people enough about this particular story, in fact, that they forget that it isn't already a movie, because initially this was going to be a screenplay, but I'll get to that in a second. But it's kind of pairing with me being productive, and also that I'm not just talking about it. I'm not just talking about it in theory, because it's easy, and I'm not mean to throw shade on anybody, but it's much easier to talk about the process. It's much easier to theoretically or theorize about what is possible or what solutions there are to different issues than it is to actually do it, is to actually apply that. That's one of the, I would say, the problems I have with, but when I hear like motivational lectures, I'm like, this is all great to listen to and be like, yeah. Putting them into practice, there's a huge gap between hearing it and going, that sounds like a great idea, and actually being able to implement it. So for me personally, I wanted to make sure I wasn't doing the easy part or the fun part, which is for me talking about it and talking about the process, and not actually doing it at the cost of doing it. That I would be doing this and I would have 300 videos about the writing process and have nothing actually written. So, I mean, I have written stories before, and that'll come up at different points, but that's not the focus of what we're talking about here. This really is, again, as I embark on this journey, I'm inviting you to journey on it with me, and as I hit roadblocks and push through things, celebrate the triumphs and mourn the failures. But the biggest thing was just to get started. And so I did do my first hour on this particular project. As I said, it began as a screenplay, because for me, screenplays are easier to write. It's more tailored to the way that my strengths in writing, which, I mean, without shooting my own horn, typically are dialogue and like the micro transactions, the actions, not necessarily the actual, like, he throws a punch and so counters with a block, left-handed block, and pivoting into a parry of, I'm just spitballing right now. But that, like, getting that nuanced is not it. I would say a fight breaks out where, he executes some really cool moves and he takes some hits, but he's able to ultimately get away. Something like that. I paraphrase that kind of thing, but I like getting into the dialogue and things of that nature, which is more or less a screenplay. You don't have to actually write out. In fact, a lot of screenplays, and it can be very tricky sometimes, the page count doesn't necessarily translate to screen time. On average, it does. On average, it's about a page per minute, an actual formatted for script page per minute of screen time. And that's on average, because you may have a page that is just all dialogue, and you're going to be able to shoot that in a very short amount of time, and it's going to take up a very short amount of screen time. And then you may have one that just says, dog fight ensues or fight scene ensues, and now you've got one sentence that is actually about 3 minutes of screen time. But, it usually works out to to be about that much. So you don't have to actually detail all the ins and outs. Some people kind of do, and I've seen some screenplays that are kind of written like novels where the descriptions of the scene are like a book. But most of the ones I've read, and to be honest, like the Star Wars trilogy, the original trilogy, I got my hands on some of those screenplays, and they are more sparse. It's tells you enough that you need to know. It's a blueprint, really. So there's a difference between that and a novel. Novel needs to be much more fleshed out. When I'm describing a scene, it's got to have a lot more details in it because there are going to be no visuals to help out. And this seems like duh, but it's the decision to make that transition was done for several reasons, and one of them being more or less practical, which is it is much harder as a writer, as an unknown quantity to Hollywood, to anybody with money who would be able to fund this project. And this, I understand right off the jump, this is not, there are relationships in it. It is a relational piece. It's got to be about people. I mean, that's what it boils down to. And that needs to be the focus and the personal growth of these characters. But there are action sequences. That it is action driven. That is what you're seeing. I mean, it's essentially a vigilante type of scenario. And that's not going to be cheap. And as you can see, this is actually an image. I guess I should talk about that really quick as well. This is artwork I did about 5 or 6 months ago, as a first phase of Incarnation. Because for somebody who likes to write or has a knack for writing, I am much more visually oriented. I like editing, in video editing, and I like drawing because you can see the progress. It's right there, and you can appreciate it. Whereas writing, just glancing at it, it's nothing. It's a block of text on a white page. It's not, you have to actually engage with it to get anything out of it. And even then, sometimes there's going to be slower parts, and whereas you can take in a picture all at once. But I'm not an artist. This took me, I'm not going to tell you how long it took me. It took me an incredibly long time. Now it's very big. I mean, I get very detailed in it, but it took me probably 20 times longer than any other artist. And it doesn't have the energy, it doesn't have the power, it doesn't have the drama of the moment as it is in my head, but it's as close as I could get. And to me, it was a way of helping to keep me encouraged. So I have that as kind of my wallpaper on the computer that I'm doing the writing on, and for the folder that I use, because that helps me. That plus some music helps motivate me, helps me remember, like, this is what you're building towards. This is a moment from the story. I'm not going to tell you where, but it is a moment in the story. And as you can see, she's got artificial legs. So I say all that to say it is going to be effects heavy, not effects driven, but it will be effects heavy, would be as a movie. So my point being, this is not going to be an indie film, low budget, the Hollywood system, even a low budget is, well over 15, 20 million. Usually it's in that range, depending if you bring in some A-list actors or how you go about that, but they're expensive. It's not something you're going to finance yourself or get, a friend or two to pitch in and come up with it. You're going to need to put some financial legs behind it for it to turn out right. I mean, and why bother doing it otherwise? So initially I'm thinking screenplay, but then I was going, well, okay, when I pitch it, or if I put it out there, I get an agent in theory and get it out there. My caveats would be, no, I don't need any money up front necessarily. It's the back end deal, a percentage, because I think a project should be worth its wages. And since I'm not doing this as a living, this is as a side thing. It's a hobby. I don't have to get that money up front. To kind of sweeten the deal, I would say I'm not expecting to get paid for this. Now, granted, I wouldn't be making a ton of money anyway. I mean, there's high-level screenwriters, yeah, they can make in the hundreds of thousands or 50,000 or probably a year's wage for most folks. If you're able to pitch a desired screenplay, one that perhaps multiple studios are interested in, but it's not going to be buku bucks. So it's not like I'm really doing a lot for it, but that's me saying I believe in this project enough that I would rather get my money off of the box office receipts than to get a flat check from you initially. And maybe they don't want that. Maybe they actually would say, hey, we'd rather just give you X number now and you don't get to touch the back end. But my big concern, especially where the movie industry is right now, is creative control. And not that I want to micromanage it. I know adaptations, that things have to be adjusted based on a myriad of factors. I get that, but I don't want the core of the story, the essence of the story, what caused me to want to write this, the emotional journey that kind of got me to this point that has formulated this plot in my head and these characters. I don't want that to be sacrificed because, we're trying to reach the broadest audience possible. I mean, now granted, you want to do that. And I don't think this story has anything that would make it would alienate it from any particular audience. It is going to have at times graphic and I would say by virtue of content, not what you're actually seeing, but knowing what's going on would be very disturbing for a younger audience. So I'm not this is targeted for, this would be a rated R film. So it's limited in that regard, but it's not, it wouldn't be restrictive to anything else. It's not going to be, it's not an art film. It's not a rom-com. It would have probably the broadest audience you can other than horror, which I don't know if that's the broadest audience, but it seems to be the most prevalent one and the one that gets the most like lower budget films. I'm not saying they're all low budget or they look low budget. It's just a lot of independent filmmakers and stuff, they tend to migrate towards the horror genre. And they usually do well. There are studios that will actually just pay for, hey, just give us, I think it's Lionsgate or something. They were at one point, they were saying, hey, just give us a library, give us a catalog of like 10 horror movies and we'll pay you, $200,000 for each one of them or something. So anyway, I'm getting a little bit off track. That's going to happen. I do apologize. I'm going to try to stay focused as much as possible, but there's a lot to try to introduce into this first episode. And I'm going to keep this at 30 minutes. I've got a kitchen timer that is going to go off at the 30-minute mark, and it's taken me a little while to get started, but this will be a little shorter than 30 minutes. Hopefully it won't keep beeping for too long after it first goes off and ruin the audio, but we'll see how that goes. Anywho, one of the big problems is that studios are not going to do that. And if they do, even if they sign something that says, okay, we will not be able to put this into a theater or put it up for distribution until you sign off on it. There are probably so many stipulations, so many ways around that. Worst case, and best case scenario, I have to hire a lawyer and take them to court because they violated it. I just don't have a lot of trust in the industry at this point. And from what I've seen, I do think that the essence of this film is not simpatico with Hollywood's vision of storytelling at this particular time. I don't know if that's going to change by the time I'm done or what, but bottom line is I would need protection for this. This is not a straight up shoot 'em up, bam bam, doesn't really matter. And not that I'm not to diss this movie, but like the Die Hard movies are very good movies. I like Die Hard 1, 3, and even Die Hard is it Die Hard with a Vengeance? That's the third one. What's the Live Free, Die Hard? I actually enjoy it. It's a popcorn movie. It's just a romp. It's just kind of a turn it on. It's got the one-liners, got some good action, got some, funny parts, whatever. They're not bad movies, but I don't feel like the screenplay would be so far removed. Like the studio execs would come back and say, oh, we want this change. I could be wrong, but it just seems like a more straightforward, linear, good guy, bad guy, this happens, that happens. Like it's interchangeable pieces. Whereas there are a lot of elements that if you nerf it or if you take that part out, I think it's going to lose a lot of what makes it resonate with me, which is what I'm hoping to communicate to an audience, what I hope resonates with them. I want people to, when they put down the book or when they leave the theater, I want that lingering sense where you have the world looks a little bit different. It feels a little bit different. The effect doesn't last, forever. I mean, probably the longest it's lasted for me when I'm done like watching or reading something that just has an impact is maybe like 3 or 4 days. And it's not constant, but it's just, it does something. You feel like it's transformational on some level in just that it gives you a different perspective. It makes you think about something. It hits you in the feel so hard that it kind of makes your stomach hurt a little bit. Like if you get punched in the stomach, your stomach is sore. It gets you in the feeling. It hits you on an emotional level that kind of leaves you a little emotionally sore, not bruised, not like you got battered or beat up, but that you're just kind of like, oh my gosh, like it just takes it out of you, but in a good way, in a fulfilling way, in a way that is memorable, and probably in a way that this isn't going to be something that you're going to want to watch hundreds of times. Like there are movies like Undercover Brother and Zoolander and the Bourne series, and I'm just looking at DVD cases I have over here, like Indiana Jones, Back to the Future, movies that are just fun to watch over and over and over again. And they're good. And I'm not saying those are without emotional resonance or without merit, but movies like Braveheart that have more weight to them, more punch to them, in my mind, a little more drama to them. They're not as fun. This is not this is not a Batman, is what I'm saying. As I mentioned, the working title is Vigilance. And it is dealing with a vigilante of sorts, which is who you're seeing there. But it is not, oh, how cool is vigilante? How cool is it to do this? And oh, ooh, pow. And it's going to have those elements in there because it's a mechanic. The violence is a mechanic. The fighting is a mechanic. It's not a John Wick, which is, how cool is this? Gun fu, where it's like you're doing all this cool stuff and whatever. This is closer, I would say, almost not tone-wise, but in terms of presentation, as like Kick-Ass, if any of you are familiar with that, where it's like, okay, try to make the hero, if somebody actually tried, not your Bruce Waynes, which even trying to ground Batman in reality in the Nolan trilogy, to me, failed utterly miserably. And it doesn't work. Like, you can't take a superhero and put them in real life. The two are not compatible. This is not a superhero movie. This is not a Batman movie. This is, or a story. I keep saying movie, but it's not that kind of a story. It's more grounded than that, and it's more gritty. And not to make it more realism and be like, oh, look at the violence, look at the blood. It's about what it's doing to the people and what the people are going through in this conflict. So that's all. I don't want to get too far into it. And I'm really going to avoid talking about the story itself as much as possible, just to avoid spoilers or, distractions. It's supposed to be about the process. But all of that to say, coming back around to the primary crux of it, started off as a screenplay, but I thought, you know what? If I was an established writer, if people knew my name and my name carried weight in the industry, I could probably go to a studio with demands like that. Hey, here's a script. If you like it, great, but I want it done to the letter, or I want creative control, essentially. If you say, we need to change this scene, we can't have this for whatever reason, either I say, okay, well then we're done, or, which in theory you would do beforehand, to say, look, read through it, you tell me what right off the jump is not going to fly for you, and we'll see if there's flexibility there. Otherwise, I'll go to another studio. I even thought about trying to send it to Japan, like an animation studio in Japan, because I think it could work there as well. But I mean, that's a lot of work. But it just seemed unfeasible to be able to communicate this vision, to communicate this story through a visual medium right now, as things are right now. It seemed like it would be a better idea to make it a book, ideally a book that resonates, that carries, that gets a lot of momentum to the point where studios are going, hey, we want to make this movie. And in theory, I think it would have to be at a different time than now, them going, and we want to maintain this message. We don't want to just take the title that people know and mangle it and distort it into our own version of whatever we think is our messaging or what have you, and just have people show up because it has the name in the title. It needs to be directly in there, and a studio that says we want to, like Peter Jackson. So when you adapt something from, and this the arguments that would be raised about this, but the adaptations that have to be done to get something from a media like a book into a film, with all the things that make a film work. You have the rise and falls. You have your rising action, your climax, your falling action. You have all these different things that kind of need to be there. Almost all the successful movies have a certain way of presenting a story to an audience through a movie. I mean, a stage play is different in its setup. Like, every medium has its own way that it works best, that it is best presented in. And so, understandably, you take a book, you've got to make changes to it to a degree in order to make it work as a film. I would argue that some of the changes that were made were not necessarily, in like Lord of the Rings, for example, were not necessarily made because the adaptation required it. They were just changes that to me were a little perplexing. And I'm not going to get into that. We can have a whole discussion on that at some other time. But some of them were a little mysterious to me. Some of them were not. Like heightening, emphasizing Aragorn and Eowyn's love story. That's 100% understand that in a movie. That's one of the elements you kind of look for, you gravitate towards. It's just having that romance, even though it's not heavy in there. It's a lot less even in the book. If it's mentioned, it's referred to, it's in the appendices, but there's not a whole lot of that in the movie. In fact, when I went and read the books, like, holy crap, where is that scene? Because I could have sworn after I saw it in the movie, it was in the book, but it's not. But something like that, I can understand. We want to give that a little more, like the audience is going to be invested in that a little bit more. But then there's some other things that aren't. And so understanding that as I write this as a novel, that there are going to be things that are going to have to be axed and taken out and changed a bit to make it work as a movie, especially if we're going for a 2-hour movie and it's a 400-page book. I don't know what the ultimate length is. I could see it being that long. It's a lot of story to tell. And that was kind of another reason. There's a lot of psychology, and I don't mean clinical psychology. I'm not going to be using, Freud said this and this and this, but there's a lot of, in those relationships and in what's going on with people, that I want to explore what the journey is like for different people. The lead character, Crystal, that's her name, where she starts off and where she ends up, and how this experience and what she does transforms her in multiple ways. Same with like her father. And oh gosh, there's so much stuff to talk about just in terms of storytelling, but I think that I'm going to be able to at least address it better as a book first, get it all out on the page, get it as fleshed out as possible, and then pare it back. And that is going to, I don't know how much time I have left, but what I really wanted to talk about is how we approach writing for the first time, like our particular style. There's a very prevalent one, a very predominant one, which is, you create an outline and you create your skeleton. And I'm not saying this is bad or wrong. It's one way of going about it. And you go through kind of scene by scene, chapter by chapter, and you say, essentially, you break down what's going to happen in the scene or in this section. And you just adhere to your outline. You can do note cards, you can do all these cool different ways to organize it, but ultimately that's what you do. You go in knowing pretty much everything that you're going to say. And it's always going to change, always going to change. Tolkien, there's a book called Letters from Tolkien, and it's him writing to his editor, to his sons, to a variety of different people, and the tone is different in all of them. He's a very quirky fellow. Very, as a British tend to be, he can insult the heck out of something or somebody, or decry it or rail against it in the most politest way, where you have to kind of reread it and you go, wait a minute, holy cow, was that an insult? It's kind of like in Lord of the Rings, when he says, Bilbo says, I know half of you half as well as I should like, and I like half of you half as well as you deserve. And in the book it says, and there was a quiet pause as they try to work out whether that came out to a compliment or not. But that's kind of the British way. Like they can do that. It's not that abstract, but it can be done in a way where they say it and you're like, oh, it sounds very nice, especially with the accent and all. And they're like, wait a minute. He just burned the crap out of me. What? But it's a way of writing. But in those letters, Tolkien does talk about like earlier drafts of Lord of the Rings. Mind you, Lord of the Rings, how big and massive that story is. Aragorn at one point was a wooden-legged hobbit, a hobbit with wooden prosthetic legs. And that has nothing to do with this, that completely not at all. But it was just, that stuck out to me because it is so far removed. I mean, you can say, oh, we tweaked a certain character. Or, at first, this character was going to have more of a role, but I brought I wanted to bring somebody else to the fore. But no, like earlier iterations of that story, and I don't know how far into it he got, but in her earliest drafts, Aragorn was a hobbit with wooden legs. How he became a man and a king with not wooden legs, I don't know. I don't know what elements got shifted around and how that transpired, but that's how different our first drafts can be from later on. And if it's going to happen to Tolkien, it's probably going to happen to me. That said, it's great to have an outline, and that's how a lot of people go. My problem is I get bogged down in the details. I'm trying to work out everything. I don't get obsessed. Like, I'm not trying to go back like 4 generations. Like, what were her great grandparents doing? But I try to like define, figure out relationships and all the ins and outs before I start writing. The timer just went off. So this has been a little more scattered than I would have liked. It's very rough, but if nothing else, this is just saying, hey, this is an introduction to the series, and it's going to be more focused than this. As I just started talking about, formats and how people approach it, I'll get more into that in the next one because that's where I'm at. I've started this, and I really need to figure out how to approach it, and I've figured out what works for me, and it isn't the outline necessarily. I have a beginning, I have an end, and I know relationships or beats more or less in the middle, but I haven't sorted it all out yet. And I think that's okay. For me, part of what allows me to be interested in this, what I found, putting it this way, what I found, unfortunately, is if I have the story all written out, essentially, whether it's in outline form or it's in my head, I have no inclination to write it down because I've already seen the story. I've already essentially watched it. I've experienced it. And now it's like, okay, now I got to go back and remember all this stuff and make sure I got it the right way. And it becomes laborious to me. Now, that said, I've had great partnerships where somebody will give me the skeleton of a script, hey, scene 1, so-and-so meets so-and-so, they talk about this. Scene 2, this person does this. And it's very bare bones, but that's really all I need. I can put the flesh on those bones. That's kind of what I'm pretty good at. I struggle a little bit more with the macro, much better with the micro. I know that strength and weakness that I'm hoping to work out here. And I have to because I'll be doing both in this adventure of writing. But I am a take a block of granite and chisel the story out from that instead of laying down building blocks to create, or laying down, crafting the piece and putting it together like a model. Some people work like a model, and an outline would be like the instructions for a model, and you have the pieces and you just put them together and you assemble them and eventually the model is done. I'm big block of granite and start chiseling, and I'll explore that and more in future episodes. I do apologize for how all over the place this has been. I'm just starting out. I just got the setup down here and I'm trying to figure things out. So thanks for sticking with me. Thanks for bearing with me. In the future, it'll probably be at least one episode a week, hopefully 2, 30 minutes long, talking about the writing process, where I am with it, what it is in general, and hopefully taking some of your feedback, things that you say, the ideas that you have, putting those out there as well. And I'm excited to be going on this journey with you. So thank you so much for watching, and I will talk to you soon.